Hello and welcome to the Crick Crack Science Live Show. I'm Valine McDougall from Upcomes PR, also known as the Science Storyteller. And today we're talking about freshwater biodiversity in Trinidad and Tobago. And we'll touch a bit on the women and girls in science. So joining me today is zoologist and lecturer at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine campus, Dr. Amy Deacon, and her interests include behavioral ecology, invasive species, patterns of biodiversity, and aquatic ecology. She's also very active on Twitter. So if you check out some of her posts at Amy_E_Deacon. So I'm going to bring Dr. Deacon in just a second. So welcome, Dr. Deacon.
Hi,
Yes.
thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you. It's such a pleasure to have you and to have this conversation today. So I think I better start with asking you, what is behavioral ecology? Is it some sort of looking at personality of organisms, and does it change with their environment and things like that?
Yeah, that's definitely part of it. It's really sort of the study of animal behavior and how animals behave in their natural environment. So
Wow.
it spans everything. And certainly there's a lot of research on sort of the equivalent of personality in different species, but all different types of behavior would come into that.
Very amazing. I've kind of heard you talk a little bit about some certain fish species and how they display certain I guess behaviors that kind of trick like make you think that they have a personality. But I would like to get into that. But let me ask you though. I mean, I know that your work centers around freshwater environments and biodiversity in Trinidad, of course. And so what drew you to this area of study, and maybe what's fascinating about these rivers and streams?
Yeah, I mean, rivers are just amazing places to study. They're really important globally because although rivers only make up less than 1% of the
Mm,
Earth's surface, they contain 6% of the biodiversity, so they're especially species rich.
wow.
And then that's even more important in the tropics, where we know a lot less about the biodiversity of our rivers and streams. So there's still
Yeah.
lots to be discovered, and of course, we can't really protect things until we understand them. And of course, the other thing about rivers is that humans use and need rivers. They're really vital to our
Right.
well-being. So that means inevitably humans are interacting with rivers and living near to rivers, which has impacts on that biodiversity. So humans and rivers are very tightly
Hmm.
intertwined in terms of what we need. We need them, but we also have the ability to damage them.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I just thought about driving by, like the Caroni River, not even thinking twice about the relevance to it, about what's in it, and the relevance to me. So, very, very true and interesting. I mean, so now we mentioned, well, the species, and I think you've written a bit about the humble Trinidadian guppy, or what we call the drainfish, here, and you've said that that's a fish to be proud of. And so, can you tell us a little bit about why you say that?
Yeah, I say that because I mean, actually, the guppy is the whole reason that I'm living and working in Trinidad for
Oh,
12 years now, because I was
yeah,
studying it for my PhD. Like lots of other people around the world in different countries have done PhD theses and lots of
yeah,
journal publications on guppies, and yet, I think not that many people were aware of that in the native home of the guppy, which is Trinidad and Tobago and Venezuela and some parts of the Guyanas as well. So
wow,
it feels like something that I'd love more people to kind of know about and put it on the realize that in the scientific community, the guppy is
mm-hmm.
held up on this pedestal as being this amazing species that can tell us so much about evolution, behavioral ecology, even medical
Wow,
research and genetics. The guppy has been used to answer questions in all of those different fields of science. And
wow,
visiting researchers come here all the time and have been for nearly 100 years. So when I'm teaching my students at UE about evolution or animal behavior, I bore them because I'm telling them all the time
no,
about the guppy because every concept that I need to explain to them in those courses, you can just bring the guppy in as a perfect example. So they're sick to
Wow.
death of it. In general, the first time I tell them about it, it's amazing how few of them realised. The first time I bring it up, they're like, "Wow, what? Had no idea that the drainfish
Exactly.
was so famous and so important." And I tell them, students around the world are learning these things about the guppy in London, in the US, and you are learning that same thing here, and you're
Yeah,
living
absolutely.
just there. Even the drains around the campus are full of guppies. So yeah.
Exactly. So okay, so the guppy, now I've also found, you mentioned before that they're invasive, but we've never thought of it, or I've never thought of it as an invasive species. So is that part of what makes it their attitude in terms of their ability to be invasive, make them sort of special as well?
Well, that's actually kind of a second part of their ecology that we've learned about more recently, which is that although they're native in Trinidad and they're naturally found in Trinidad, so they're found everywhere, and that's how it's meant to be. In recent decades, they've been spreading around the world. So they've been exported from places like Trinidad and Venezuela to every continent apart from Antarctica. And the reason being for two reasons. One is that they are actually quite good at eating mosquitoes.
Yeah.
Whether they
Okay.
actually reduce diseases like malaria is still up for debate. But they certainly enjoy eating mosquitoes. So they've been introduced with the belief that they will make a big difference to human
Right.
disease. And then, of course, even if you're introducing them into small areas, they spread. And then also, they're a really popular pet. You get ornamental fancy guppies, and they will then spread if you release them unwanted pets and things, and they can sort of revert back to their wild guppiness and spread underneath. So
Wow.
they're actually now found in about 70 different countries, and most of those are not their native countries. And they're not the
Wow.
worst invasive species, but they can have negative effects on the native organisms in those countries where they've now sort of established themselves. So I want to emphasize that in Trinidad and Tobago, no, nothing to worry about with guppies. They're meant to be here. Um,
Yeah.
it's not something to be concerned about, but it's really fascinating to me as a biologist why they are able to be so successful when they are introduced into other countries. And by studying guppies in Trinidad, we can learn a bit about their characteristics that might make them really good invaders. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, so
And they
that's one of
seem
my. Sorry.
right, and they seem to be able to adapt really well because I mean, if they are tropical usually, and then they are all over the place,
Yeah,
that's quite interesting
that's
that they
right. They
can
have quite a
adapt.
wide temperature range, and but if you think about it, they're used to living in Trinidad and Tobago, where um, they're found up in the mountains, but also down in the ditches in the city. So even that they actually do
Oh,
have to undergo, they have to tolerate all the
right.
seasons. They have to dry season, wet season, slightly cooler, slightly warmer, different conditions of pollution. So it's not that surprising that they've got that adaptability from how they've evolved here, which translates
Right.
to them being really good at spreading in other places. Yeah.
Very true. Wow. I mean, I just thought about the drains and how you can have such different environments in the drains itself, depending on where and they can survive in there. So that's surprising as well.
It's
So
surprising.
I actually had an experience recently, a few weeks ago, and I was walking my dogs, and it's in an area in Central where they have a few ponds.
Mhm.
And in this particular pond, there's a bridge over the pond. So I'm walking towards the pond, and there's a man sitting on the edge of the bridge, and his feet is dangling in the opposite, in the, like, kind of over the water, and he's smoking a cigarette, and I'm thinking, gosh, I'm glad I have my dogs, because I'm not, it looked peculiar at first, and then as I I walked closer to him, I realized he was fishing. So he had a little float on the top of the water and his fishing line. And
Hmm.
so I asked him, what kind of fish do you get there? Do you get like cascadoo? Because the first thing that comes to my mind is cascadoo. And he said, yeah, I might get cascadoo, but sometimes I get wabin. And wabin is something I hadn't heard of. And my mom, who wasn't far behind, she kind of, I told her about it. She hadn't heard about wabin for like, since she was a young girl as well. And it was interesting because the pond isn't, to me, directly connected to any real water source coming in. And and I wouldn't even think that there was fish there because it seemed a bit stagnant and also, still. And and so it was just surprising that he would be fishing there and fishing there successfully as well. And so what can you tell us perhaps about the wabin, as far as how did even it get in that pond? See.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
it is surprising, but now with what I know about Trinidad's fish, they don't surprise me as much anymore because I've learned not to be surprised.
Right.
There are two different fish that are known as Wabin in Trinidad. One is the jumping Wabin, and then there's the Wabin. So if he was
Okay.
the Wabin is biggest, that might have been what he was talking about because it might be a bit more edible, and they're
Right.
quite a big predatory fish. But what they have in common, both the jumping Wabin and the Wabin, is that they're both adapted to being able to survive low, sort of dry conditions, and kind
Wow.
of, they both of them have adaptations which allow them to some extent to breathe outside of water.
Mm-hmm.
The jumping warbine can actually travel really successfully over land, as can the
Wow.
zanji, actually, another one of our species that can do that. Which is all because, in dry season, sometimes they have to do that to find somewhere suitable again. So they've actually
Mm.
adapted to be able to breathe air from air, not from in the water, oxygen from air.
Fair.
So
Wow.
they can survive those low oxygen conditions through those adaptations, which is really incredible. Yeah.
Unbelievable. I mean, you just said Zanji, and I haven't seen or heard the word Zanji in such a long time. And I guess is Zanji is kind of like an eel, would you say?
So it's not actually an eel, but it looks really similar to an eel. So an eel is a fish,
Mm-hmm.
and we do get the American eel coming into our rivers in
Mm-hmm.
Trinidad and Tobago. And then you have the
Wow.
zanji, which is a swamp eel. So they're both fish, but they're
Mm-hmm.
not that closely related to each other, even though they look really similar to each other.
I
Yeah.
see. All right. So, I mean, so switching gears a little bit. So it's been suggested that certain stereotypes have steered women and girls away from science-related fields. And you've been, probably working in the field, in the rivers, near swamps and rugged areas. Have you encountered any gender stereotypes along the path to your career? And how did it affect you?
So I think I've been very lucky in that I haven't had very many direct sort of
Oh, that's good.
experiences that have been negative in that regard. But it definitely
Mm-hmm.
is something that I know people do encounter. And of course, it's something that even subconsciously, is something that we all get
Yeah.
affected by. There's certainly some people would perceive that women would be less able to do field work, less strong or less, willing to get
Yes.
dirty. So I think that is a stereotype that you have to kind of combat a bit. The idea that we can do that just as well as men can, um,
Yes.
which maybe you have to prove yourself a little more than a man might in those situations.
Mm. Yeah.
But I've seen enough, have had enough role models and enough peers, that I've never felt that barrier myself. But
Right.
certainly is something.
Well,
Yeah.
that's good because I mean, though they tend to say that the statistics show that say 30% of researchers worldwide are women. In the Caribbean region, they say it's actually more like 40 something percent, which is shows that we're kind of doing a little bit better in terms of women in the science field. So maybe that's part of it. But
Yeah.
so would you have? So I guess along those lines, perhaps you would not have really encountered people being surprised when they say Dr. Deacon and then they realize, well, it's not Mr. Deacon, when they come in. Have you really had any of that
No,
kind
not
of?
really, and especially because the main place when I would use my title might be, among other
Yes,
scientists, and so then it's not so
right,
surprising. I don't know whether
right.
if I had, more encounters using that title outside, maybe you would get that a bit
Got
more.
you.
Um, but yeah, and,
Very
and Yuri, I
interesting.
have to say, among our students, we have a really good representation of girls in our biology courses, in our
Wow,
programs. But
that's excellent.
I know even at UWI and worldwide, the issue is more about sort of losing that proportion just
Hmm.
diminishes when you get to the upper ranks. Even at my level, when I was recruited as a
Yes,
lecturer, there were 5 of us recruited at the same time at the lecturer level, and all of us were women, which was amazing. And it was great to have that
yeah.
cohort together to support each other. But if you look higher up the ranks, the senior lecturer professor, it just diminishes, and those senior positions are very much still male dominated even today.
You actually rolled right into my other question, which was basically that statistic that I came across, that it it was actually mentioned in an article in the United Nations Barbados and Eastern Caribbean page, and written by Rayanne Prescott, and she mentioned this UNESCO statistic that said that women occupy fewer senior positions than men at top universities. And so you've already said that you've certainly certainly experienced that, and that really says that maybe there's a equality issue there that we haven't really tapped into or sort of shed just completely yet. So maybe we still have work to do in that area for sure.
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
So just so dialing back a little bit, what would you say is it is really important about the kind of work that you do?
Well, I mean, I think, well, I don't know where to start. I mean, there's
a lot.
There's a lot. Yeah. I mean, working on, as I mentioned before, by freshwater biodiversity is especially important, both because it's lots of species, but also because it's connected to humans, but also because it's one of the most threatened ecosystems as well, just because of that, that interaction with humans that's inevitable. And paired with that is that historically the tropics have been far less studied than some of the temperate regions, which means that we don't really have things like long-term data on how what is kind of normal amounts of change in which species and how many species are in our rivers, or even in our other ecosystems as well, as it happens. It's really rare to find those longer-term studies. People might go and sample and they get a snapshot. But what's really useful, especially when you want to say, well, is there a human impact happening here? Or do we need to be concerned about this new threat or this habitat? You need to know, well, is that normal over time? Because, of course, nature changes every day. It's dynamic. So just saying, oh, there were more here this year than last year of a certain species isn't very informative. But if you've got a 10-year data set, then you can actually see trends that could be really help you to pinpoint that. So one of the projects I was involved with when I first arrived in Trinidad to live and work was a project where we revisited rivers 4 times a year for 5 years, the same rivers. So we could just get a real feel for what's a normal amount of variation in those rivers, which then mean that now we know what's kind of normal, the baseline, which means you're much more able to detect any problems. So we also were looking, at that point, we were particularly interested in recreational disturbance. In other words, river lines.
Exactly.
People use the rivers, not so much these days because, there's restrictions in place, but generally, people love to spend time at rivers, eating, drinking, music, just relaxing. And that can have an impact on those rivers. So we were interested to see if we could detect like a signature of a river lime effect on the species and the environment at those rivers over time. And that was a really interesting project to be involved with.
Did you actually find, I guess, pre-pandemic that and then I don't know if you've done or looked at it after the pandemic as well to kind of see if there was a definite change in the resilience, I guess, in the environment, perhaps.
Yeah, it's something that certainly crossed my mind, that this has been a really good opportunity for that. Unfortunately, we weren't actually able to. We've only just been allowed to really access the rivers properly. But we do have plans later this year to revisit those same sites again that we did a few years ago. So if we're able to do that a few more times, then it'll be very interesting to see what we're looking at there.
It really sounds like it would be important to see that, because especially because, but then you mentioned the data that you would have gathered over the years. Would that kind of data be sort of available to the public or even people who might be doing research, or so, to kind of see or use in their in work that they're doing?
Yeah, it is actually. It's in a big database called the Biotime database, which is a huge database with lots of different data sets, but ours is one of those data sets, which means anybody can access that if they want to do some analyses or use it to ask some questions as well, or they can just email me. But
I have some friends who would really be glad to hear that, that big data is available, because we always feel sometimes that information is really lacking in a lot of areas. And so I like to hear when people are working toward improving that. So that's really inspiring. But then you mentioned, as you talk about data, I know you were doing some work with a project at the herbarium. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, of course. So that database I just talked about, the Biotime, is about like long-term data sets. This new project that we're involved with is more about existing data sets of like specimens in museums and herbariums, and making sure that they're not just in a collection on a shelf, that data is online for literally anybody to access. And Trinidad and Tobago has some representation on this global database, but it needs more. So the Department of Life Sciences, we were awarded a grant last year, and we're working in partnership with the National Herbarium of Trinidad and Tobago, with the UE Zoology Museum, which is based in our department, and with the National Museum and Art Galleries of Trinidad and Tobago, who not many people realise have their own natural history collection. So those three partners, we are working in a team, and actually it's an all-female team, as it happens. So, it's a great team. And
That's great.
Our aim over the next 18 months is to upload and publish as much of that data as possible. So it's records of species. So anything we've got preserved in the museum or the herbarium will be a row on a data sheet that anybody can then, you can see what species it is, who collected it, when it was collected. All the information that we have on those specimens will be online and accessible. And this is really important, not just for, I mean, it's just interesting to be able to see that. But also that sort of data can be so important for like conservation policy decisions. If you want to see what species are in a particular location, or any declines that you can even detect using these kind of databases. Also for education, it means any teachers or lecturers can use that in with their students, or you can actually do research. And I've had 2 project students this year from 3rd-year zoologists at UE been using this online database to extract certain data and ask questions about Trinidad and Tobago's biodiversity using that freely available data, which is really cool.
I'm so glad that you mentioned the education side of it, because as soon as you mentioned it, I immediately thought about high school students and so on who would just love to be able to find the content that is relevant to the environment that they know, and really see that there's history behind it, and how far back they can go. So I mean, I think that's really awesome and really good to hear that you are doing that job. And as you mentioned, all female team, brings me to my next question, which is, do you find that femininity, for lack of a better word, brings a different perspective perhaps to the work that you do?
So I'm not conscious of femininity as such.
Yeah.
What I do feel strongly about is that
Yeah.
in all fields, and maybe what I know is science, it's clear that having a community that is diverse in terms of your backgrounds, in terms of your gender, in terms of your ethnicity, and all of those things bring diversity, which brings new perspectives, and you're going to be more productive, you make more discoveries. I don't know, it's just
definitely
a positive thing, and so it's hard to put your finger on exactly what or why, but it's definitely the more variation and diversity in the people in science, the better. And so addressing some of those imbalances that and underrepresentations is really important.
Yeah, and that reminds me of a quote from the United Nations Secretary General, which I'll share with you in a little bit, because it speaks about exactly what you just said. But I just have a couple more questions before we wrap up, and that is, for instance, was there ever a moment in the field, or on the job, or perhaps in the lab, that you would rate as one of your most fascinating or inspiring experiences to date, that you can probably share with us a little bit?
That's a good question. I mean, I really love my job. I really love living and working here, and pandemics made it harder.
That's
but
great.
When you're in the field, up in the Northern Range, for example, and you're surrounded by forests, and you're doing it, and you realize you're doing this as a job, I mean, that really gives you pause to think, wow, I'm really lucky. And so there's been lots of moments like that. It's hard to put my finger on a single one.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, for me, time you mentioned Northern Range, I mean, my experience in the Northern Range, perhaps is like hiking through the Northern Range, and you just stop and look out, and you just kind of stunned by just the natural beauty of it all, and then you actually get to work in it. So I guess that I can see how that can have an impact on someone. So I will just roll on to this other question. Who would you credit as having the most influence in your success as a woman working in the science field?
So I'd say that, I mean, growing up, I was definitely encouraged by my mother, who was a teacher and a nature lover. So I was very much encouraged. Like, I learned all the names of the species and would love sort of pond dipping, with a little net. And I guess if I was in Trinidad, I would have been catching guppies, but I might have been catching minnows, and rock pooling at the seaside and things like that. So that definitely would have started me off on the right track. But it wasn't until I was doing A-level at like age 16, 17, 18 that I sort of realized that connected with something I could actually study or do a job in that sort of thing. I hadn't really made the link before. I'd kept those things separate. And then I just loved A-level biology, and I loved my degree. And then I was lucky enough at doing my PhD to have a supervisor who was a really inspirational mentor, Professor Anne McGurran. And, she's a great example of, she's a woman in science. She's reached that. She's a professor. So she has managed to break that ceiling. And she's just very, very supportive, very, always looking out for the best interests of her students.
Excellent.
And actually, even since then, she's somebody who, even though I graduated from my PhD more than 10 years ago now, she's always looking out for me and finding opportunities and helping to collaborate. So I really appreciate that. And I think people underestimate that, supervisors don't stop supervising once you've handed your thesis in. It's nice to have that community to support you in your career after that.
That's excellent. So I guess shout out to Mom and to Professor. I didn't catch her last name too well.
McGurran, Professor Anne
McGurran. Very good. Excellent. So, okay, so as we wrap up now, do you have any advice for perhaps girls who might be, I guess, A-level or not, considering careers in science? Any advice you want to leave with them?
I think my advice would be to follow your passion. And I think, sometimes you might feel some pressure from family and around you to kind of be pigeonholed into a particular career. And my advice is, to look into the diversity of science careers. If you're good at science at school, it's not just medicine, and it's not just engineering. There's a whole range of diverse and interesting careers. And what I do is just one of them, but there are so many different jobs. And even though you might feel some pressure to go into kind of one of these very established careers everyone's heard of, traditional careers, don't be penned in by that, There's so many cool things. And sometimes, you might feel like, well, there's not very many opportunities in that field. But if it's something that you're really interested in, then, persist and go for it, because we need more people like you.
Yeah, excellent. Such good advice. All right. So as we wrap up here, I just wanted to share that quote that I mentioned earlier. That really, I kind of mentioned some of it before, and Dr. Deacon, you really kind of explained it after. It says, "Women and girls belong in science. Yet stereotypes have steered women and girls away from the science-related fields. It is time to recognize that greater diversity fosters greater innovation." And indeed, you did allude to that. And that was a quote from the United Nations Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, which I think is a good place to kind of wrap up our conversation today. And I really want to thank you, Dr. Deacon, for giving us much insight into the local freshwater biodiversity here, and being one of the many women succeeding in and advancing, science. So thanks again, and thanks everyone for joining in.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks so much. Yeah.
Thank you. And I would say that the International Day of Women and Girls in Science is on February 11th. And we continue to advocate for equal access so that more and more women and girls can contribute and participate in all levels of science, technology, engineering, mathematics, disciplines. So with that, I would say thank you for joining us. And if you enjoy the program, check us out. Tell us, comment, share, like at Upcomes PR. Bye for now.